We still cannot read the text of the Voynich manuscript, but we have a pretty good idea of when it was made. I did a video about that a while ago. Following the scholarly consensus, we can safely date the manuscript to a couple of decades in the early 15th century. Finding out where it was made is a lot more complicated though. Analysis of the inks and pigments shows that they were compatible with 15th century Europe, but that's about the only thing our currently available techniques can tell us. That leaves us with the imagery, which does offer some indications of geographical origin. One such indicator is the subject of this video, the swallowtail merlons on the Rosettsvoldout, the upright part of castle battlements. We also call them Ghibelline merlons, after one of the warring factions in 12th to 14th century Italy. The Ghibellines supported the Holy Roman Emperor, and the Guelphs aligned with the Pope. Since the Ghibellines were associated with imperial authority, they tended to dominate the regions in northern Italy. It's not always possible to present a clear overview of the situation though, since important cities like Genoa switched allegiances depending on which political family was in power. On the Rosettsvoldout, we see swallowtail merlons in two locations. There are some very clear examples on this stretch of wall bottom left, and most famously on the front-facing wall of this structure, colloquially known as the castle. Now you might think, excellent, let's just look for a castle like this in Italy, and we know where the Voynich manuscript was made. Sounds reasonable, but unfortunately there are a couple of issues. First off, we don't even know if it's a castle. Swallowtail merlons are found on civic buildings like the Palazzo Pubblico in Piacenza, or even religious structures like the cathedral in Lucca. If it represents a castle, we don't know if it has ever existed. Medieval maps and drawings often contain generic castles or walled cities that are not necessarily meant as portraits of existing architecture. If it indeed refers to an existing place, it doesn't have to be one in medieval Italy. Here's an example of swallow-tailed Troy, with a Trojan horse and everything, as imagined by a 14th century artist in Venice. And here the Crusaders are besieging a swallow-tailed Jerusalem. Or how about the city of Hell in this illustration of Dante's Divina Commedia? And then perhaps the most complicating factor is that today forked battlements are found everywhere, even on the Kremlin walls all the way over in Moscow. They remained popular architectural features long after the Voynich manuscript was made. With all this going on, I have to say that I often found the discussion about the castle rather confusing. People were finding many examples, but there was a lack of cohesiveness and control. That's why I started a collaborative project on the Voynich Ninja Forum. People would collect examples of swallowtail merlons, and I would add them to a map. After a while, I decided that this map would need 3 layers to depict the situation. One for extant buildings, of which the finder could demonstrate to a reasonable degree that they already had swallowtail merlons in the first half of the 15th century. A second layer for works of art, again, up to about 1450, that depict swallowtail merlons. And then a third layer specifically for manuscript illustrations of swallowtail merlons. The dot is placed where the manuscript was made, not the location of the building it depicts. This particular layer is my favorite because the Voynich manuscript belongs in it. If we knew where the Voynich was made, we should place it somewhere on this third layer, since it is indeed an early 15th century manuscript with a depiction of swallowtail merlons. Let's start with the buildings layer. At first glance you might notice that Italy is pretty empty for what is supposed to be an Italian trend. That is because the Italian examples were not very interesting to us. We know they are there, and we know that most Italians would have been familiar with swallowtail merlons. We did add some interesting examples. My favorite one is this one Marco Ponzi discovered. The Roman-era Porta Palatina in Turin had swallowtail merlons added to it in 1404, which were only removed in the early 20th century. But naturally, people mostly focused on the periphery to figure out how far away from the Italian centers these battlements existed. There's a type of forked battlements found exclusively in the Iberian Peninsula, but I felt like including these would have been a bit misleading. They have their own distinct appearance, which we don't see reflected in the architectural style of the Voynich buildings. Some relevant examples are found in buildings made by Italians outside of Italy. There are several extant Venetian castles around Charistos in Greece, at least one of which was certainly built before 1450. The fortifications of Rhodes are a tricky case. Swallowtail merlins appear all over this illustration made in 1490, but we know that the city walls had shortly before been rebuilt after siege by the Ottomans and a devastating earthquake. We decided to include them on the map, but consider them uncertain. The furthest outlier we found is from the Genoese colonies on the Black Sea. We are fairly certain that the fortress of Sudak in present-day Ukraine already had its swallowtail merlins in the early 15th century. However, our main concentration of entries is here in the southern Alps. These are defensive castles built by powerful families like the Milanese Visconti. In some places you can even see how a row of castles follows an important mountain pass. Some of these structures are little more than a simple tower, like the beautiful castle Foppoli. Nowadays it's a hotel, not a sponsor. It's got a hot tub and your dog is welcome. Most of these entries were collected and carefully screened by Peter Tentaculus, who showed us just how common these types of battlements are in the area. Peter also keeps claiming that swallowtail merlins did not exist north of the Alps before the very end of the 15th century. I'd love to prove him wrong, but haven't found anything so far. Our current collection does appear to suggest a clear northern limit. At one point Nick Belling appeared to make sure we included the Castel Grande at Bellinzona, which has parts that are really reminiscent of the long wall at the bottom of the Rosette's page. It's truly spectacular, and we were able to confirm the authenticity of the crenellations. In summary, outside of mainland Italy, we find swallowtail merlins within the sphere of influence of cities traditionally aligned with the Ghibelline faction. Towards the east, the Genoese left architectural traces all the way to Crimea in Ukraine, and in the north, numerous alpine castles mark the extent of Milanese power. Let's now move on to the second layer. All kinds of medieval artworks containing swallowtail merlins. I say all kinds, but in practice it's mostly frescoes. These overlap pretty well with the buildings layer, so there aren't any surprises here. Several frescoes by Giotto are worth mentioning, like the one in the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua. His work in Assisi is the most southern one we found so far. Another noteworthy fresco is that of the courtiers having a snowball fight at Buon Consiglio Castle in Trento. During his journey to Italy at the end of the 15th century, the German Renaissance artist Albrecht Dürer painted this beautiful watercolor of the castle. The fresco is in the Torre Aquila, this square tower on the right. The castle itself is also a wonderful example of the architectural features we are looking for. Here you can even see swallowtails in earlier building layers, which were integrated whenever they raised the walls. Finally, let's move on to the third layer, and in my opinion the most important one for us. Pre-1450 manuscripts depicting swallowtail merlins. As I said before, the Voynich is one of those, but we don't know where to put it. Remember that all locations on the map indicate the place where a manuscript was produced. Do not take these too literally. For example, if 5 manuscripts were produced in the region of Venice, I just put them there with some space in between so you'd actually see that there are 5 dots. So these are regional indicators, not markers of specific scriptoria. We have a couple of outliers here, specifically this Hebrew manuscript known as the Sarajevo Haggadah, probably made in the area of Barcelona. There's also this exceptionally northern example from a Feldchronique made in German Bavaria in the late 14th century. In case you wonder which Italian castle is being depicted here, it's a house in biblical Sodom. Most of our examples, however, are found in 3 main areas of manuscript production: Naples, Lombardy, and the Veneto. I do apologize for my pronunciation of some of these words. I'm trying to kind of guess how English speakers pronounce words in foreign languages, and at the same time also pronounce it correctly in those foreign languages. So I'm landing somewhere in between, probably upsetting everyone. Samples from Naples show considerable influence from other areas. These two manuscripts were written in French. Naples was ruled by the Anjou in the late Middle Ages. My favorite is this one about the feats of the Romans. This miniature represents none other than Julius Caesar besieging the peoples of Britain in the 1st century BCE. And at least one of the southern examples we found is by a Venetian author, Paul of Venice. When it comes to large volumes of swallowtails in original manuscript art, we're really looking at the areas around Milan and Venice. Let's start over here. Remember that I just kind of spread out these dots over the general region. Of this one we do know that it was illuminated in Padua before 1430, in the surroundings of Pietro da Pavia. We see swallowtail merlins in this siege that appears to take place in the Holy Land, and even on ships in naval battles. There's an interesting example in the Tractatus de Herbis tradition of herbal manuscripts. One of its many illustrations is a walled garden where balsam is harvested. In these two 14th century versions from southern Italy, the walls have regular crenellations. But in this version, made in the Lombardy region around the year 1440, the walls are now swallow-tailed and guarded by imperial knights. The occurrence of the merlins and the coat of arms of the Holy Roman Empire together appears to suggest that the political meaning of swallowtails was still significant. Next, we have a manuscript of La Quête du Saint Graal et la Mort d'Arthur, made in Milan or Pavia in the late 14th century. King Arthur's mythical Camelot has, why not, these cute little swallowtail merlins. As we often see in these medieval images, scale was of no concern. Our next manuscript was made in Milan around the same time, and uses swallowtail merlins in a similar way, as a backdrop for courtly figures. You'd wonder how he ever got through that gate. We continue with the theme of interesting scales with this manuscript from about 1400. A swallow-tailed hexagon holds the brothers Aimo and Vermando as they perform a feat of superhuman strength. It just keeps getting weirder in this manuscript from the same region, made around 1435. It's got giant hands kind of caressing the architecture, an understandable sentiment. Let's now move over to the area around Venice. Our first manuscript is one of the 13th century. It's got these schematic-looking castles in the margin that appear to me somewhat cruder than the other images. The text contains moral and spiritual advice, encouraging the reader to uphold virtues such as faith, humility, and obedience, while avoiding sin. It's entirely unclear to me what that has to do with these ugly castles and who drew them in the margins, but well, they are there. Our next Venetian manuscript is held at the Voynich library, so it shares its home with the Voynich. The Cibaldone da Canal is a 14th century merchant's commonplace book, which is like a scrapbook of various things they found noteworthy. It includes a number of buildings which interestingly remind me a bit of those in the previous manuscript. Next up we have two manuscripts that both originated in the same 14th century Venetian workshop, though the artist was Genoese. They are works of propaganda for a new crusade, and as such they contain images and maps of the Holy Land. Here's one of the crusaders knocking their adversaries on the head as they flee towards a swallow-tailed city. And this map of the Holy Land has long stretches of wall and various simplified buildings reminiscent of the Rosette's folio. We could go on like this for a while, but these samples should have been sufficient to give you an idea of what we're dealing with. This exercise has underlined the Italian character of swallowtail merlins. Some parts of Italy and the southern Alps appear to have them around every corner, and even the architectural outliers are explained by Italian merchants and architects traveling around. That includes the Kremlin walls, by the way, which were designed by Italian architects at the very end of the 15th century. Depictions of swallowtail merlins in non-manuscript art, mostly frescoes, coincide pretty well with the core region of the architectural form in the northern half of Italy. When it comes to manuscript art, we have a few outliers that are harder to explain. This underlines the portable nature of manuscript materials as well as the mobility of artists. It's certainly much easier to draw a North Italian castle than to actually build one in Augsburg. Something I noticed while making this video is that the majority of manuscripts we found draw swallowtail merlins on buildings that could not have had them, like a Roman-era British fortress, biblical Sodom, or the gates of hell. This does not necessarily mean that the Voynich castle is fictional, but we must still keep this tendency in mind. Despite what some people claim, the structure of the building is pretty simple, and it could very well be meant as a castle icon, rather than a literal portrait of one. Even if the artist just drew a castle without having a particular one in mind though, the presence of these typical battlements could still tell us something about him. If the Voynich artist drew a castle like this, there's a good chance they grew up in an area where forked merlins were the norm. That doesn't mean the manuscript was necessarily made there though. All but the lowest social classes of the Middle Ages had the option to travel, and they often did. Now, if you'd like to have a look at the map for yourself, it's the first link in the description below. Keep in mind that this is still a work in progress and will basically never be finished. If you know of any item we missed, just leave me a comment and I will add it. Keep in mind the 1450 limit though. If you want to add a building, you must have a good indication that it already had swallowtail merlins by the early 15th century. Finding this information is a lot of work and sometimes simply impossible. If you happen to know of any relevant manuscript illustration that's not yet on the map, those are definitely welcome as well. Finally, I want to express my thanks to Marco Ponzi, who really helped me improve the script for this video. I hope you found this introduction to swallowtail merlins in the context of Voynich research useful. If you did, please consider subscribing to the channel, since I'm planning to publish a deep dive into the Voynich manuscript every month. That's it, and I'll see you next time.